instruction, who is running tech support for us today. So thank you, Molly. If you have any questions today, I ask that you pop them in the chat. My colleague, Courtney Grant, who isn't able to join us today, makes it a little challenging. It's not her fault. She's doing what she should be doing right now, but it just means it's just me. And so if there are questions, put them in the chat and I will try to answer as many as I can when we come to natural breaking points. But I also have office hours this afternoon where you can come and ask one-on-one if you prefer as well. And I have information about that at the very end. So that's what I'd like you to do if you have questions, please, please. So our agenda for the day starts with critically examining our why. We will then talk about specific strategies for getting to know students as people, then as learners, and we will conclude with some additional resources that you can use to continue your learning at your own pace. And so we are going to begin with a little bit of reflection to ground us in our work together today. What I'd like for you to do is to picture in your mind your favorite teacher. Take a moment and stretch your brain and think about that favorite teacher. We're going to reflect on this individual. Now, it might be the teacher who made you passionate about learning and you felt supported and seen in their classroom. Whoever this person is and whatever your reasons are, I want you to think about, from their perspective, how do you think they saw you as a learner in their room? How do you think they saw you? And I'm going to give you about a minute. And what I'd like for you to do is to type a word or two, maybe a phrase, that answers that question. How do you think your favorite teacher saw you? How do you think your favorite teacher saw you? And as you feel ready, go ahead and pop that in the chat. How do you think your favorite teacher saw you? Capable. That's a beautiful word. Inquisitive, interesting. Focused, needing support. Quirky, but with potential. Are we talking about houses? Capable, unique, helpful, caring, sweet and shy. Funny and smart. Willful, warm, not a lost cause. Capable but underperforming. I want to say thank you all for your honesty and sharing those perspectives, because my follow-up question for you is, how did this relationship with this teacher impact your ability to learn? I know you don't have to type this in the chat, but I just want you to hold that in your heart of how did that relationship with this teacher impact your learning? So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, because in stark contrast, I'd like you to think about your least favorite teacher. Ugh, that least favorite teacher. In answering the uncomfortable question of, how do you think they saw you? And do not put this one in the chat. This is just to show in stark contrast with those two people and what power they have over us as learners. And how do you think that relationship impacted your learning? And now, while we're reflecting on our own experiences, you can generalize this for students as well. As we see in the chat, this is a shared experience that our relationships with our teachers matter. Teacher bias, whether implicit or explicit, absolutely impacts student learning. You are correct if this is something that you were thinking before, that bias impacts learning. And I linked here an article from Harvard University that talks more about it. But a quotation I pulled from it, it's really powerful. In the article, it says, "I would argue that what's most important is to ensure that the systems in a school and a district are set up so that they do not replicate systems of systemic inequality." Because teacher bias, which leads to us having favorites and least favorites, implicit or explicit, absolutely impacts the quality of education in our schools, which brings us to our why. When teachers have an open mind about who their students are, they have an opportunity to truly see them. And when we have an open mind about our students in our classrooms, we are also modeling a mindset we want our students to embrace as well. Now, our dedication to this is critical, and the juxtaposition of the two teachers we just reflected on just a moment ago definitely shows that in public education, there's two different possibilities. And over time in our country, that juxtaposition has changed a lot too. So that experience we just had of those two different teachers, if you look at the beginning of public education and you look at modern public education, you see a similar juxtaposition. Now, here's an image of the first public school in the United States. This is the Boston Latin School, which opened in 1635 and was open only to boys and led by a Puritan self-settler. Now, this school served a narrow population. It had very explicit bias. Now, in stark contrast are our modern public schools. We serve every student and we operate under the unflinching conviction that all students are entitled to a high quality education. And now, while the first public school served white Puritan boys in Massachusetts, our schools serve students of many different cultures with complex identities. Now, who public school serves and the commitment to equity is stronger than ever. The strategies I'm sharing today with you are based on the work of Dr. Hawley, who is an author, thought leader, and expert in culturally and linguistically relevant teaching practices. In this image you see in front of you, this graphic, you see the rings of culture that influence the identity of an individual. An individual like yourself or your students may have certain rings of culture that are more obvious to an outsider, but that may not reflect the complexities of their identity or reflect which rings of culture are most important to them. So it is important to use strategies to intentionally get to know our students with all of these complexities at the beginning of the year and truthfully year-round. So I'm going to show these rings of culture because they're very important, and one more context. Now, this graphic shows the rings of identity not stacked on top of each other, but rather as individual fluid concepts. And for each of us, if we were to think about ourselves, and we were to take a moment to really consider how we each individually identify, you might describe to someone else how each one of these circles relates and intersects with another. And like if these were physical circles, you may even stretch them and like overlap them in ways that really represented who you are. So for yourself, I would like you to just like take a moment to think for yourself individually. Which of these rings of rings of culture are most central to how you identify? Which of these rings of culture are less important? And was this always the truth, or has it changed over time? Taking time to reflect on our own identities provides insight into just how complex the identities are of the students who walk into our classrooms. And so this quotation from one of my favorite resources, Edutopia, I have found that investing time early and often to learn about students by making small changes in our classroom creates an environment where they are motivated to be successful. So I'm going to go back to that question I asked you at the very beginning. How did your favorite teacher see you? We all had very different answers because we were different people. But the truth in all of those is that our teachers saw us in favorable ways. And they were able to see us in ways that impact student learning. So we're going to dive in already. We're going to dive in and we're going to begin by addressing timing of these activities that we want to incorporate in our classroom. And then we're going to look at specific examples. So we sometimes talk about the first weeks of school being the most critical, and this is definitely the case, but I want to connect to the work that you heard earlier from Anna and Mark. And building off of that, they spoke about, in the building blocks for behavior this morning, they said to consider when to build relationships. And the answer was often and always. But of course, when you first meet somebody, your students, it is going to be really important to spend time intentionally getting to know your students. So let's talk about those building relationships. So when we talk about students as people, there are some factors, 3 of them, that we're going to talk about in depth. The first is their family and home culture. Families are equal partners in attaining educational goals for students. Now, when teachers view families and that family-school relationship as essential for a student's optimal academic and social-emotional learning, their in-school and out-of-school time start to connect. And so there are some examples of things that really impact this ability to get to know your students. And I have 4 examples, and I think Molly has an example too, of how to get to know your students from this perspective. First is names matter. When all of you came into the meet today, I greeted you by your name. And I asked for, in a couple scenarios where I wasn't sure about pronunciation, how do you say your name? Because I want to know, and your name matters. So greeting students by their names with correct pronunciation is absolutely one way to make that family and home culture connection. Home visits are a hidden secret of our pre-K and kindergarten teachers. And in a time of COVID is like not even conceivable in a traditional sense. Something I always did with my class was home visits at school. So this is also pre-COVID, but having my families bring something from home, whether that's food or photos or some artifact that's important to them as a family, bringing that to school and just spending 30 minutes at a time with each family, getting to know them, was absolutely an investment that paid off so big every single time. This might be a virtual home visit, having a student give you a tour of some of the things that are important in their home that they can share with you. And then maybe the same could be done in like reverse for school. Your student giving a tour to their family at home. Family surveys, asking families, what is important to you as a family? What makes you unique as an individual family? And then one of my favorite strategies I ever did was with our name placards that are very common in elementary classrooms. I'm sure it's true in other settings as well, but they typically just have their student's name and maybe there's like a number line on them. I took those name placards and I sent them to families and I asked parents to first write their student's name. It wasn't going to be my handwriting all over the classroom, but it was going to be something so simple as a child seeing their own mother's handwriting on their desk. And then on the reverse side, I had the families write a note to the student that they could reference when they're having a tough time or needed a little extra love. And so with my second grade students, I would see them throughout the year flipping over their name placards whenever they needed to take a moment to remember their home and family, because they absolutely belonged in our school, and that was important to the students. So simple things, like these are 4 examples that I can speak to, and Molly, if you want to type it in the chat or unmute, please feel free to. But if you have other ways that you spend time or you are excited to do with your families, please share right now in the chat one way you would like to involve or get to know families in your classroom at the beginning of the year to get to know them better. So my next topic that I'm going to discuss with you is student interests. Now, student interests, much like families, are going to be varied. It's going to be based on what they've been exposed to and what makes them excited. 4 ideas for how to get to know your students' interests are a student survey. Ask your students. Seek student opinions when you are going about building your classroom. Do we think that this should be here or there? Where do we think we should have this set up? Often in our classrooms, when we ask our students what book for a read aloud should we read next, when we are involving students in those choices, their interests are having an opportunity to be part of the classroom. We can help students also make connections with each other. Getting to know our students isn't just about the teacher getting to know each individual student, but also students learning to get to know each other as well. And this can include non-academic conversations, not just about the things we're learning about, but also what are things that make you excited outside of school? And I have some more strategies for that as well. And then also their student experiences. We want to check our bias and assumptions about our students' experiences. They often come with varied experiences that we'd like to tap into. And so we want to involve our students in storytelling, creating those opportunities. One of my favorite ways to do that is through something like morning meeting or class meetings. So once we have a really solid understanding of who our students are as people, we also want to really think about who they are as learners. Our students are complex people. Getting to know our students as learners, much like people, requires purposeful planning. What are our students' learning preferences? This can be culturally based and oriented. Students who maybe blurt out an answer, like in that original old schoolhouse we looked at earlier, that may have been perceived as acting out an undesirable behavior. But if we look at it from humans are complex, it could also be a cultural behavior where in many cultures, spontaneity is part of conversation. It is a communication preference, and it is a valued trait. And so when our students come into our classroom and we have a better understanding of who they are, their communication preferences, their learning preferences can be validated. We can provide opportunities where students can blurt out, when they have those opportunities to express themselves in that cultural way. But then we can also validate and affirm that, and we want to build and bridge, and this is something Dr. Holly talks a lot about, so that they can also do things like taking turns when they're talking as well, so that our students can be successful in many different academic settings. We can provide opportunities that meet their cultural needs, their cultural preferences, and then also, as thinking about them as learners, we also want them to be successful in different settings, so we can also teach them turn taking. And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other, just that both have their place, especially when we think about the world our students live in. School is not 100% of their world, nor is it ours. So when we're getting to know our students as learners, we're aiming to answer 3 questions in order to get to know our students. First, we want to know, what do my students already know? We also want to answer the question of, how do my students prefer to learn? And finally, what are my students ready to learn next? And with these questions in mind, we are going to talk about the 3 ways that you can gather information about your students. We recommend observations, watching your students. We are going to recommend asking your students the actual answers to these questions, and then looking at student work. And I'm going to go back to those 3 questions, and then we're going to examine these questions once more, but with these 3 methodologies in mind. So when we're looking at, what do my students already know, we can gather more information about this by looking at student work, observations, and conversations with our students. How do my students prefer to learn? Observations, conversations, survey. And then finally, what are my students ready to learn next? We can look at student work and gather information via surveys in order to answer that question for our students. So strategies for your classroom, things you can do to get to know your students as learners. First, with observation. One way to do this is to literally choose one student to focus on for a lesson. It could be for 15 minutes, it could be 10 minutes. This is the student you're going to sneak a glance at every now and then to watch and make sure that you are gathering information about that student. Focus on that student and really look, how are they interacting with other students? How do they approach the task that you give them? Are they jumping in right away? Do they take a moment to watch the other students around them? Do they choose to work independently? Are they gravitating towards somebody else in the classroom consistently? We can also gather information via student survey. We can create visual surveys with questions about different ways we learn. Which do you prefer? Asking students individually, either individually or as a whole group. Let's vote. Do we prefer using a pencil and paper to do this kind of work, or do we prefer whiteboards? Why or why not? Really getting to our students' preferences. Would also ask, like, where are you comfortable working? Where is your body physically comfortable? Often in a classroom, we say we are doing this work at the carpet now without really consideration of, are my students physically comfortable? So asking our students creates a learning environment where they can succeed, where our bias is not going to make it harder for our students to succeed. And then also asking our students, what does good learning sound like in a classroom for you individually? Now, looking at student work, this could be assessment data. It could be writing samples, formative assessment that you use throughout your lessons, or even video responses via a platform like Flipgrid or Seesaw. And then also, as like a caveat to all of these, sometimes our students need help to understand themselves. When we ask these questions, they may have a direct response, they may not. They may need time and guidance in answering that. That could look like conferencing with students about what you see and notice. I noticed you chose to sit by yourself this week when you worked on math. Why do you think that is? What does it feel like when you're working on math in your body? Asking our students via just observational data can help our students understand themselves a little bit more as well. And I do want to include in here a word of caution. My word of caution is that in our effort to get to know students, we sometimes go to cumulative files or to previous teachers to get that information. I will say that my word of caution to any early career teacher is to be very careful and judicious about this. And Molly and I had the conversation about this previously, that often we find that it paints a picture of a student from last year or even older, and it is a very narrow image that can replicate bias. And so each year, the conviction I'd like for each of you to hold is that students deserve an opportunity to be new people in a new classroom with a new teacher and peers that are slightly different from the year before. Students deserve that. And so my word of caution is to be careful, because it makes it hard for you to form a relationship with that student, for you to have an open mind, and it kind of works against that which we hold true, that students deserve that opportunity. So I have some more strategies for you to try. And this is also a time when it'd be really great if you have other strategies for getting to know students as people or as learners, to pop those in the chat as well. So first, with relationship building, and these are all linked. If you see it's underlined, that is a link that you can click on to read more. For relationship building, I have this article that links to CASEL, and it's just giving guidance on what a 5-minute conversation with a student can look like and why it is powerful to forming a relationship. Just 5 minutes. And as we said earlier, Mark and Anna said it, and I said it too, we put in a lot of effort at the beginning of the year to get to know our students, but really this happens often and always. And 5-minute chats with students is a great way to do that. Also, if you are into icebreakers, this is contentious on our team. We talk a lot about icebreakers, and we're like very split on whether or not we like them. I love icebreakers. If they are your thing, especially at the beginning of the year for getting to know students, helping students in a structured way to get to know each other, Cult of Pedagogy has many articles on this. This is my favorite from them that is linked here. And then also I wrote a note here about show and tell variations. Show and tell is like a very popular way to get to know students in academic settings. I had a college professor do it with us once, and we all loved it. But I would like to stress that there should be variations to it. Students aren't always comfortable sharing about themselves personally in front of a large group in a traditional show and tell. Like, I bring my thing from home, you all stare at me, and then I have to use my courage to get out all the words I wanted to. And so some variations to this might be a me bag, where students have like a paper bag and everything they can fit in it from home they bring to school to represent who they are. Or it might be a star student that happens throughout the school year, that you spread it out. There might be a theme. Today, we are all bringing pictures from home that represents our family. And you may put those up as a gallery, and students maybe could write a little piece or record a video explaining why it's important to them. You might do a gallery or museum of things that are important to me for my interests, and that could be like a museum, right? Your classroom has these artifacts around it with little placards. And video submissions could come from home as well. Say a student doesn't feel comfortable themselves speaking, but maybe if their grandma or grandpa is there with them, they might feel comfortable telling you about their favorite item in their home. So keep in mind that it does take time to feel comfortable sharing for some learners, and part of that is cultural. So providing variety in how students can share, like a partner, small group, one-on-one, can really give an opportunity for more students to participate and for their identities to be celebrated in your classroom. So moving to the right-hand side, some ideas for getting to know our students as learners. I included here a data protocol from the National School Reform Organization. This data protocol is wonderful, especially for looking at data and stripping away assumptions we make about what our student data tells us. We have a lot of assessments we have to give. And so really taking the time to get what we can from them, even though they may not be our favorite way to learn about students, can be really powerful. This is a really great collaborative opportunity too, if you have a grade level or a group of teachers at your school, to dive into data together and to try out a protocol in a way that's not someone telling you to do it, but you have the opportunity as a group. Kid watching, which is a shift in thinking about observation of students that attempts to see their experiences from their student eyes, is linked here. This is from Reading Rockets. And then I included 2 samples of a learning style inventory that you can explore. And if you use this, I do suggest including visuals for learners, just thinking of language proficiency and nuance of language that visuals can really reinforce and make that more accessible to all students. Molly, would you like to share anything?
It's such an interesting thing because, so as a young teacher, I had trouble with making relationships as I'm neurologically divergent. So relationship building for me is always something that is very difficult, and it has to be super intentional. One of the things about that I learned about building relationships with students as people is that I needed to learn to be vulnerable. And in order for them to feel safe in communicating with me, I had to feel the safety in communicating with them. So anything that I did that was relationship building, I took part in as well. So whether it was things like I'm doing a 5-minute chat, I'm going to participate in that chat from my perspective too. If I'm doing an icebreaker, I'm part of that icebreaker. One of the icebreakers I really love to do with my 5th grade students at the beginning of the year was a scavenger hunt. So each of them had a form that they had to fill out, and we would just spread around the room, and the form would say something like, find someone who traveled to 3 different places this summer. Find someone who has 5 or more siblings. And and the person that filled it out the most ended up getting a little bit of a prize, whether it was extra time at recess or picking a read aloud, whatever it was. But those are things that really helped that. But then continuing those throughout the year. So doing them all the time, every week, every day in little bits and pieces, and returning to it while also participating in it myself. And then with students as learners, one of the things that I found most effective was having at least one student-directed activity in each unit that I did. Something that was aimed towards passions that my students had, so that I could see them in an environment where they were really motivated themselves and see what that did for them as learners. Their behaviors change massively as learners if they are self-motivated versus if they are gaining motivation from you. So observing that intrinsic motivation in those moments of student excitement teaches us a lot about what our students naturally do as learners, which is highly impactful. So.
Thank you so much, Molly. I think you bring up a really great point too, that this is something we get better at all the time. And so like these resources are here for everybody to revisit as you have capacity, because this process, like Molly said, is ongoing, full of mistakes, and it has iterations, literally every year. So every teacher fine-tunes this with each passing year, and I find that the most critical element of this growth is, of course, an open mind, which brings us back to our why. The way we approach our practice as lifelong learners is exactly what we aim to model for our students. So I say thank you for taking on the courageous work of really getting to know your students, of revolutionizing education each year. Through each iteration that we go through, we see change. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment as new educators. Just thank you. I will stay on for a few more minutes to answer questions. I know we have back-to-back sessions, but I also want to remind you that there are office hours today from 2 to 3. I will be in the general office hours, and I also included my email and our team's email, so you can contact us further. And I believe you all have the link to the presentation as well. So thank you, and we can stop recording, Molly.